When a man believes he owns the world, his greatest vulnerability is his own arrogance. On a freezing Manhattan night, finance mogul and syndicate leader Damian Blackwood walked into his $12 million mansion with a pregnant mistress on his arm, expecting to break his wife, Victoria, once and for all. But instead of tears, he was met with a chilling, calm smile. Victoria simply slipped her 3-carat diamond ring off her finger, left it on the marble table, and walked away not in defeat, but because she had spent the last 4 years systematically dismantling his empire from the inside out. By sunrise, Damien would realize that his accounts were frozen, his assets locked, and the very mansion he stood in no longer belonged to him. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's a masterclass in how a systemized, brilliant mind can entirely neutralize brute criminal power without ever raising her voice. Welcome to our channel, a sanctuary for those who understand that some people are born to rule, not through violence, but through absolute intellect. We don't just tell crime stories here. We dissect the high-stakes mindset, the unshakable composure, and the hidden psychological architecture behind true, enduring power. This story brings a profound lesson to light. True power never lies in physical intimidation or stolen millions, but in your intrinsic capacity to stay calm under pressure, protect the innocent, and outthink your opponent when they believe you are at your weakest. If you value real strategic mindset, deep human resilience, and stories that challenge your intellect, please take a moment to like this video, share your insights in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a single lesson in ultimate power. The cold, gray light of dawn was just beginning to bleed through the heavy velvet curtains of her study when the grandfather clock in the hallway struck 6 times. Victoria had not slept a single wink, yet the heavy, suffocating exhaustion that usually accompanied an all-night vigil was entirely absent from her posture. Her spine remained perfectly straight against the rigid back of her mahogany chair, and her eyes, dark and hyper-focused in the dim light of the single desk lamp, never strayed from the cascading columns of financial data on her laptop screen. In the quiet of the early morning, the mansion felt entirely different, less like an expensive private fortress and more like a massive, sleeping beast whose vital organs were being systematically shut down one by one from an untraceable internal terminal. She could hear the distinct, structural groans of the old house settling into the frozen ground, a low, persistent hum that vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of her dark trousers. Exactly at 6 o'clock, a soft, deliberate percussion sounded at her door, 2 precise knocks that carried zero hesitation, without waiting for a verbal invitation. Marcus Webb stepped across the threshold and closed the door behind him with a gentle, metallic click. Marcus was a big man, a broad-shouldered silhouette framing a gray winter morning, standing 6 feet tall with thick, rugged hands that still looked as though they belonged on a heavy construction site rather than the elite corporate offices of New York City. For decades, those hands had performed intense physical labor before he transitioned into high-level administration, managing Eleanor Sterling as modest, intricate affairs in Dayton with a quiet, unshakable competence. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he walked with measured, silent steps across the Persian rug and set 2 heavy porcelain cups of black coffee onto the desk, without an ounce of unnecessary ceremony. The rich, dark aroma of the fresh brew rose between them, momentarily masking the sterile, chemical coldness that always seemed to linger near the room's high ceilings. Marcus leaned back slightly, his piercing gray eyes locking onto Victoria's face with the intense, unspoken assessment of someone who had known her long enough to read every microexpression hidden behind her flawless legal armor. He cleared his throat softly, his deep, rumbling voice dropping to a low, confidential register that never carried beyond the thick wooden door. Raymond Vance had left the estate exactly at 4 o'clock in the morning, Marcus reported, his tone as flat and informational as a financial ledger. But it wasn't the attorney's departure that mattered. It was what he did right before he walked out the door. Marcus explained that at precisely 3:47 a.m., Raymond had been standing entirely alone in the dim foyer, holding up his personal cell phone and meticulously taking multiple photographs of the front entry table. He had taken wide shots to capture the entire architecture of the entrance, followed by hyper-focused close-ups of the exact spot where Victoria had abandoned her 3-carat diamond ring hours earlier. Victoria looked up from her laptop, A cold, analytical stillness settling over her features as she absorbed the data. She didn't blink, nor did she show a single trace of resentment or shock. Her mother's mathematical mind instantly went to work, connecting the photographs to the larger, predatory legal strategy Damien was attempting to deploy against her. They were building a highly curated narrative, she stated flatly, her voice cutting through the quiet room like a razor blade. By documenting the abandoned ring in situ before dawn, Damien and Raymond were preparing a factual record to present to a civil judge, intending to argue that Victoria had accepted the introduction of Vanessa, walked away entirely voluntarily, and that the terms of her departure were completely civil and mutually agreed upon. They wanted to use the next 48 hours to establish undisputed possession and legal occupancy of the estate, painting her sudden absence not as a forced eviction, but as a voluntary abandonment of her marital rights. Marcus nodded slowly, his broad shoulders shifting as he took a sip of his coffee. He had already reached the exact same conclusion long before he knocked on her door. And his silent nod was merely an absolute confirmation that their strategic assessments were flawlessly aligned. He pulled his own phone from his dark jacket pocket and placed it gently onto the desk next to her keyboard, sliding it forwards so she could view the images he had taken over the last few hours. Victoria scrolled through the digital files with practiced efficiency. Marcus had been busy while the rest of the house slept. He had managed to capture clear, high-resolution photographs of the occupants currently moving through the East Wing. There were 2 people currently stationed in the guest wing alongside Vanessa. One was a young woman named Briella, who had been identified as Vanessa's personal corporate assistant. But it was the second figure that drew Victoria's immediate, undivided attention. Sitting at the large mahogany desk in the East Wing study was a lean, dark-haired man in his mid-40s. Even in a candid, low-light photograph taken through a partially open door, the man projected the eerie, unnatural stillness of someone who spent his entire life inside closed rooms where violent, high-stakes decisions were being made. He had a sleek laptop open in front of him, flanked by thick, rubber-banded stacks of printed internal financial documents that belonged to Blackwood Enterprises' most private holdings. Marcus asked if she recognized him, his voice laced with a subtle, dangerous tension. Victoria paused on the image, her mind pulling a memory from 18 months ago, a cold, exclusive dinner Damien had hosted at the Pierre Hotel for a select group of out-of-town investors. The man had been introduced briefly as an independent corporate consultant from Chicago. He hadn't given a last name, and given the heavily guarded nature of Damien's network, she hadn't pushed for one at the time. Marcus's quiet expression didn't change, but something behind his gray eyes underwent a sharp, chilling recalibration the moment she uttered the words Chicago consultant. They both knew exactly what that euphemism meant in the context of Damien's real business. The man in the photograph was not an independent auditor. He was the financial architect of the Chicago syndicate, brought to New York to scrub the accounts and ensure that Damien's dirty assets were fully insulated before the impending collapse. Marcus asked how long they had before Raymond Vance, or the Chicago consultant, realized that the entire East Wing building was no longer Damien's to control. Victoria leaned back, tapping her fingers rhythmically against the desk. It depended entirely on how thorough Raymond's title search was, she explained. Raymond was an exceptionally sharp, precise corporate lawyer. If he was looking directly at the property transfers with suspicion, he would uncover the Sterling Trust deed within 36 hours. But if he foolishly assumed that the routine restructuring paperwork was exactly what it appeared to be on the surface, it would take them much longer to realize they were trespassing. Victoria turned her attention back to her glowing laptop screen, her face illuminated by the harsh, blue light of the monitor as she prepared to pull the master lever on Damien's entire banking network. She explained to Marcus that she had already deployed the first 3 pre-programmed strategic instructions to her external legal and financial teams. At exactly 9 o'clock a.m., the primary holding company accounts that funded Damien's daily operations would begin automatic restriction, freezing his short-term liquidity. Simultaneously, the independent property management firm that handled the lucrative commercial leases for his entire network of Manhattan nightclubs would receive a formal, notarized notice of a total change of authority, routing the cash flows directly into her private accounts. And most importantly, She was now formally activating the operational audit framework of the entire estate accounts, a legal mechanism that she and Marcus had carefully constructed in secret 2 years ago. Waiting for the exact moment, Damien crossed an uncrossable line. Marcus picked up his coffee cup and drained it slowly, his large frame entirely unbothered by the sheer magnitude of the financial war they were initiating. He set the empty cup down, leaned over the desk, and looked directly into her eyes, stripping away the professional distance for just a brief, human moment. He asked her if she was truly all right, his voice carrying the deep, protective weight of a man who had watched her navigate 12 years of an increasingly toxic, dangerous marriage. Victoria looked back at him, her breathing perfectly controlled, her expression as steady and unyielding as granite. She told him honestly that she was not all right, but that she was absolutely going to be. Marcus studied her for a beat, satisfied with the ironclad determination in her voice, and nodded slowly as he stood up to leave. At the door, Marcus paused, his thick hand resting heavily on the brass knob as he remembered one final, critical piece of data. He reminded her that Vanessa Collins was fully detailed in the private research file he had placed on her desk 6 weeks ago. Victoria confirmed that she had thoroughly read the file, knowing about all three of Vanessa's meteoric corporate promotions within the Blackwood investment firms, the highly inflated performance reviews that supported those rapid advancements, and the explicit signature of Damien Blackwood that sat at the bottom of every single one of those corporate documents. Marcus looked down at the floorboards, a brief flash of hesitation crossing his rugged features as he noted that Vanessa might not actually know the full, predatory picture of what Damien was setting her up for. Victoria nodded her dark head in slow, calculated agreement. She told Marcus that she knew Vanessa was merely an instrument in Damien's grand design. That was precisely why her name was in the legal file. She was absolutely not the target of the destruction that was about to unfold. Once Marcus left the study, Victoria turned back to her computer, completely oblivious to the fact that her black coffee was growing stone cold on the desk beside her. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, finalizing the digital trapdoors that would snap shut across Manhattan at 9 o'clock sharp. As she worked in the absolute silence of the early morning, her mind drifted to the acoustic patterns she had heard hours earlier through the floorboards. Damien had slept until exactly 9:30 a.m., which was significantly later than his usual rigid schedule, a distinct behavioral signal that told her he had been drinking heavily in the dark after she had walked away from him in the foyer. She had lain awake in the dark of her bedroom, listening intently to the specific percussion of a man moving recklessly through a large, empty house. She had heard the soft click of the heavy liquor cabinet opening in the library, followed by the heavier, aggressive slam of the door closing. She had felt absolutely nothing she was willing to name as she listened to those sounds. No grief, no panic, only a cold, systemized countdown. At exactly 9:45 a.m., Victoria closed her laptop and walked down to the sunlit breakfast room, sitting quietly at the table with a plate of toast while reading a dense legal brief on her personal cell phone. Moments later, Damien appeared in the doorway. He was fully dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, but he looked distinctly disheveled in the specific, telling way of powerful men who had slept fitfully in their clothes and mistakenly believed a hot shower and expensive cologne could hide the rot underneath. He stood in the frame for a moment, his bloodshot eyes locked onto her across the long table, his face displaying a subtle, tense recalibration as he assessed her complete lack of emotional fallout from the previous night. Victoria looked up from her phone for a fraction of a second, her expression entirely unreadable, before casually looking back down at her legal text. Damien stepped into the room, his voice low and tight as he noted that she didn't have to spend the entire night hiding in her study. He claimed he had been awake working, using her name with a forced, performative familiarity that made her stomach turn, instead of remaining standing to maintain the physical dominance he usually favored during corporate confrontations. Damien did something that caught her entirely by surprise. He quietly sat down in the chair directly across from her. He placed his large forearms flat on the wood, leaning forward slightly to project an aura of intimacy and reason. He told her in a soft, low voice that he knew this situation was incredibly hard for her, and that he knew this wasn't the path she wanted, but that he desperately needed to do this the right way, by being completely honest with her face to face. Victoria slowly set her piece of toast down, her dark eyes rising to meet his with the force of a tectonic plate shifting. She cut through his rehearsed monologue without a single ounce of heat, pointing out that he had brought his pregnant mistress into their shared home, that he had ordered Raymond Vance to take predatory photographs of her abandoned ring at 4 in the morning, and that he currently had a Chicago crime syndicate consultant stationed in her East Wing going through her private financial documents. Damien S.'s expression shifted instantly, the calculated mask of the reasonable husband slipping away to reveal the cold, defensive calculation of a mafia boss who had just realized his opponent had a much clearer view of the board than he ever anticipated. Damien leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he asked her a genuine, unvarnished question. What are you going to do? For all the dramatic performance of the night before, the calculated public humiliation, and the staged entrance, this was the first real, unscripted conversation they had experienced in years. Was the question Damien desperately needed answered, so he could calculate exactly how much legal or physical danger he was in. Victoria looked at him for a long, agonizingly silent minute, letting the absolute weight of her presence suffocate the room. She could feel the intense, desperate effort he was putting into reading her face, hunting for any flicker of anger, fear, or resentment that he could use to find an exploit. But there was absolutely nothing to see. Damien Blackwood had built his entire criminal empire on his unique ability to read human weakness. And the sudden, terrifying realization that he could no longer read his own wife was the most dangerous position he had ever stood in. Victoria simply picked up her phone, looked back down at her documents, and said flatly, "I'm going to finish my toast." Damien sat perfectly still for another full 60 seconds, his jaw clenched, entirely paralyzed by the complete absence of any visible reaction. He stood up and left the breakfast room without uttering another syllable, completely unaware that the 9 a.m. deadline had already passed, and the invisible grid of his empire was already beginning to freeze solid beneath his feet. It was 2 in the morning when Victoria finally sat down at her desk. The silence of the master bedroom was thick, heavy, and absolute, punctured only by the rhythmic, distant hum of the radiator fighting the brutal February freeze outside. She did not turn on the overhead lights. Instead, she illuminated a single low-set desk lamp that cast long, amber shadows across the dark mahogany wood. She put both of her hands flat on her thighs, closed her eyes, and breathed deeply through her nose, waiting for the expected emotional aftershocks to hit her. For 12 years, she had been the pristine, unyielding shield that stood beside Damien Blackwood, granting him the legitimacy his blood-soaked empire desperately required. She had braced herself for a sudden, violent arrival of grief, or perhaps a blinding wave of rage at the calculated humiliation he had just executed in the foyer below. But as the minutes ticked by on the small silver clock beside her, neither came. What arrived instead was clarity, sharp and cold and almost chemical, cutting through her exhaustion with the exact same unforgiving sting as the sub-zero Manhattan air outside. Her mind, which had been forced into a state of careful suspension during the confrontation, began to move with a terrifying, calculated velocity. Victoria Sterling had not always been wealthy, though the predatory elite of Manhattan society took great pleasure in forgetting that detail. New York had a peculiar, violent talent for absorbing ambitious outsiders whole, polishing away their rough edges, and then presenting them to the world as if they had always existed in their current, pristine form. But Victoria remembered the bitter truth of her roots. She had grown up in Dayton, Ohio, in a cramped, drafty house with only one bathroom and a temperamental furnace that quit on them every single February without fail. She was the proud daughter of a civil engineer who worked grueling, unforgiving hours just to keep the lights on, and a brilliant mother who kept the books for two small businesses in town. Her mother, Eleanor Sterling, possessed a rare, mathematical mind, a brain that didn't just calculate numbers, but could comfortably hold multiple complex systems and hidden patterns in place simultaneously without ever losing a single vital thread. Eleanor had passed away 6 long years ago, and Victoria still felt her absence like a missing tooth. It wasn't a constant, blinding pain, but her tongue always seemed to press against that empty, aching space whenever the world grew too cold or dishonest. Sitting alone in the dim light of her study, Victoria opened her laptop, her fingers moving across the keys with an unnerving, practiced stillness. She had inherited Eleanor's mind in its entirety, where other people thought in straight, predictable lines. Victoria thought in intricate networks, invisible connections. in the highly volatile relationships between seemingly unrelated things. That mind had carried her out of Ohio on a partial academic scholarship to Ohio State, and later to Columbia Law School on a full ride. She had arrived in New York City at 24 years old with exactly $1,100 in her checking account, a cheap suitcase, and a capacity for sustained, hyper-focused attention that most ordinary people found deeply unsettling. It was that exact capacity that had drawn Damien to her in the first place when they met at a high-end fundraiser for a legal aid organization. He had been 35 then, already fabulously wealthy, immensely connected, and generating the kind of dark, intoxicating gravity that forced entire rooms to rearrange themselves around his presence. He had been funny in a sharp, slightly dangerous way, and attentive in a manner she had not yet learned to recognize as a beautifully choreographed performance. He asked her deep questions and actually listened to her answers, a trait so exceedingly rare in her world that she had fallen entirely in love with a version of him that she now understood was carefully constructed solely for her consumption. The illusion of a happy marriage had lasted for perhaps 3 years, maybe 4 if she was being exceptionally generous with her memories. After that, the relationship had decayed into something purely functional, then tightly managed, and finally, simply structured. They became two high-powered actors maintaining a grand, expensive arrangement because it served dark purposes neither of them cared to articulate out loud. Damien desperately needed the sterling name, her flawless legal reputation, and her deep philanthropic connections to mask his underworld operations. She made him look like a legitimate pillar of New York society, hiding the reality she finally uncovered by year 5 of their marriage. That Damien Blackwood was a man who operated in several criminal worlds simultaneously and was fully honest in absolutely none of them. His legitimate corporate businesses were real, but they were a heavy velvet curtain hung over a massive money laundering machine. His political connections were genuine, but they were transactional in dirty ways that could never survive public scrutiny. He was in partnership with brutal men from Chicago, whose fortunes came from dark, bloody places that crumbled under the slightest examination. When the realization of his true nature had fully set in years ago, Victoria had faced an agonizing choice, one she had re-examined from every painful angle during the small, lonely hours of nights exactly like this one. She had not left him. Leaving back then would have meant throwing away her leverage, losing all access to his financial data, and forfeiting her ability to protect herself when the inevitable implosion occurred. Instead, beginning in the 6th year of their marriage, she chose to stay and quietly, meticulously build the architecture of her own exit. It had started small, a private trust established strictly in her own name, seeded with her inherited funds from Eleanor, and structured by off-the-grid attorneys in a way that was completely separate from anything Damien or his accountants could touch. Then came a second trust, a maze of holding companies, and a series of strategic property transfers handled with absolute discretion. She had spent 4 grueling years documenting his empire, not out of an initial desire to destroy him, but because her survival instinct told her that the only real protection she had against a mafia boss was undeniable: ironclad knowledge. The stunning centerpiece of that secret architectural defense was the very house they were sleeping in. Over the course of 3 years, through a flawless sequence of highly complex legal transactions, Victoria had systematically shifted the deed of the West 74th Street mansion, along with 3 other major properties, out of Blackwood Enterprises and directly into her mother's trust name. Damien S. accountants had processed the mountains of administrative paperwork without ever truly understanding the long-term systemic effect, because they were Damien S. accountants arrogant, rushed, and conditioned to view Victoria as a harmless, compliant wife who merely handled the boring administrative complexities of their shared holdings. Damien had blindly signed every single deed and transfer document she placed in front of him, without reading a single line, viewing her labor as the natural order of things. He genuinely believed he was an invincible king ruling over an untouchable empire, completely blind to the fact that his brilliant wife had been quietly dismantling his foundation from the inside out. As the digital clock on her laptop shifted to 2:30 a.m., Victoria began composing the first in a highly synchronized sequence of emails that would take exactly 11 days to deploy their full, destructive effect across Damien's financial network. She looked toward the dark window, watching the snow lash against the glass, and allowed herself a cold, humorless smile. downstairs in the East Wing. Damien was celebrating his grand triumph, entirely wrapped in his own overinflated ego. He had promised his pregnant mistress a luxurious, permanent suite and an elite staff within the historic estate. He had brought a violent Chicago cartel architect into her home to intimidate her and secure his dominance. But the devastating truth, waiting just beyond the morning horizon, was that the East Wing Damien had so magnanimously gifted away did not belong to him. Vanessa Collins, Raymond Vance, and Damien Blackwood himself were currently sleeping in a multi-million-dollar fortress that they had absolutely no legal right to occupy. They thought they had backed a vulnerable woman into a corner. But Victoria was already moving her knights across the board, ready to prove that the grand empire Damien Blackwood had built was nothing more than a beautifully decorated cage. And she held the only key. The cold, gray light of dawn was just beginning to bleed through the heavy velvet curtains of her study when the grandfather clock in the hallway struck 6 times. Victoria had not slept a single wink. Yet, the heavy, suffocating exhaustion that usually accompanied an all-night vigil was entirely absent from her posture. Her spine remained perfectly straight against the rigid back of her mahogany chair, and her eyes, dark and hyper-focused in the dim light of the single desk lamp, never strayed from the cascading columns of financial data on her laptop screen. In the quiet of the early morning, the mansion felt entirely different, less like an expensive private fortress and more like a massive, sleeping beast whose vital organs were being systematically shut down one by one from an untraceable internal terminal. She could hear the distinct, structural groans of the old house settling into the frozen ground, a low, persistent hum that vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of her dark trousers. Exactly at 6 o'clock, a soft, deliberate percussion sounded at her door, 2 precise knocks that carried zero hesitation. Without waiting for a verbal invitation, Marcus Webb stepped across the threshold and closed the door behind him with a gentle, metallic click. Marcus was a big man, a broad-shouldered silhouette framing a gray winter morning, standing 6 feet tall with thick, rugged hands that still looked as though they belonged on a heavy construction site rather than the elite corporate offices of New York City. For decades, those hands had performed intense physical labor before he transitioned into high-level administration, managing Eleanor Sterling's modest, intricate affairs in Dayton with a quiet, unshakable competence. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he walked with measured, silent steps across the Persian rug and set 2 heavy porcelain cups of black coffee onto the desk without an ounce of unnecessary ceremony. The rich, dark aroma of the fresh brew rose between them, momentarily masking the sterile, chemical coldness that always seemed to linger near the room's high ceilings. Marcus leaned back slightly, his piercing gray eyes locking onto Victoria's face with the intense, unspoken assessment of someone who had known her long enough to read every micro-expression hidden behind her flawless legal armor. He cleared his throat softly, his deep rumbling voice dropping to a low, confidential register that never carried beyond the thick wooden door. Raymond Vance had left the estate exactly at 4 o'clock in the morning, Marcus reported, his tone as flat and informational as a financial ledger. But it wasn't the attorney's departure that mattered. It was what he did right before he walked out the door. Marcus explained that at precisely 3:47 a.m., Raymond had been standing entirely alone in the dim foyer, holding up his personal cell phone and meticulously taking multiple photographs of the front entry table. He had taken wide shots to capture the entire architecture of the entrance, followed by hyper-focused close-ups of the exact spot where Victoria had abandoned her 3-carat diamond ring hours earlier. Victoria looked up from her laptop, a cold, analytical stillness settling over her features as she absorbed the data. She didn't blink, nor did she show a single trace of resentment or shock. Her mother's mathematical mind instantly went to work, connecting the photographs to the larger, predatory legal strategy Damien was attempting to deploy against her. They were building a highly curated narrative, she stated flatly, her voice cutting through the quiet room like a razor blade. By documenting the abandoned ring in situ before dawn, Damien and Raymond were preparing a factual record to present to a civil judge, intending to argue that Victoria had accepted the introduction of Vanessa, walked away entirely voluntarily, and that the terms of her departure were completely civil and mutually agreed upon. They wanted to use the next 48 hours to establish undisputed possession and legal occupancy of the estate, painting her sudden absence not as a forced eviction, but as a voluntary abandonment of her marital rights. Marcus nodded slowly, his broad shoulders shifting as he took a sip of his coffee. He had already reached the exact same conclusion long before he knocked on her door, and his silent nod was merely an absolute confirmation that their strategic assessments were flawlessly aligned. He pulled his own phone from his dark jacket pocket and placed it gently onto the desk next to her keyboard, sliding it forward so she could view the images he had taken over the last few hours. Victoria scrolled through the digital files with practiced efficiency. Marcus had been busy while the rest of the house slept. He had managed to capture clear, high-resolution photographs of the occupants currently moving through the East Wing. There were two people currently stationed in the guest wing alongside Vanessa. One was a young woman named Briella, who had been identified as Vanessa's personal corporate assistant, but it was the second figure that drew Victoria's immediate, undivided attention. Sitting at the large mahogany desk in the East Wing study was a lean, dark-haired man in his mid-40s. Even in a candid, low-light photograph taken through a partially open door, the man projected the eerie, unnatural stillness of someone who spent his entire life inside closed rooms where violent, high-stakes decisions were being made. He had a sleek laptop open in front of him, flanked by thick, rubber-banded stacks of printed internal financial documents that belonged to Blackwood Enterprises' most private holdings. Marcus asked if she recognized him, his voice laced with a subtle, dangerous tension. Victoria paused on the image, her mind pulling a memory from 18 months ago, a cold, exclusive dinner Damien had hosted at the Pierre Hotel for a select group of out-of-town investors. The man had been introduced briefly as an independent corporate consultant from Chicago. He hadn't given a last name, and given the heavily guarded nature of Damien's network, she hadn't pushed for one at the time. Marcus's quiet expression didn't change, but something behind his gray eyes underwent a sharp, chilling recalibration the moment she uttered the words Chicago consultant. They both knew exactly what that euphemism meant in the context of Damien's real business. The man in the photograph was not an independent auditor. He was the financial architect of the Chicago syndicate, brought to New York to scrub the accounts and ensure that Damien's dirty assets were fully insulated before the impending collapse. Marcus asked how long they had before Raymond Vance, or the Chicago consultant, realized that the entire East Wing building was no longer Damien's to control. Victoria leaned back, tapping her fingers rhythmically against the desk. It depended entirely on how thorough Raymond's title search was, she explained. Raymond was an exceptionally sharp, precise corporate lawyer. If he was looking directly at the property transfers with suspicion, he would uncover the Sterling Trust deed within 36 hours. But if he foolishly assumed that the routine restructuring paperwork was exactly what it appeared to be on the surface, it would take them much longer to realize they were trespassing. Victoria turned her attention back to her glowing laptop screen, her face illuminated by the harsh, blue light of the monitor as she prepared to pull the master lever on Damien's entire banking network. She explained to Marcus that she had already deployed the first 3 pre-programmed strategic instructions to her external legal and financial teams at exactly 9 a.m. The primary holding company accounts that funded Damien's daily operations would begin automatic restriction, freezing his short-term liquidity. Simultaneously, the independent property management firm that handled the lucrative commercial leases for his entire network of Manhattan nightclubs would receive a formal, notarized notice of a total change of authority, routing the cash flows directly into her private accounts. And most importantly, she was now formally activating the operational audit framework of the entire estate accounts, a legal mechanism that she and Marcus had carefully constructed in secret 2 years ago. Waiting for the exact moment Damien crossed an uncrossable line, Marcus picked up his coffee cup and drained it slowly, his large frame entirely unbothered by the sheer magnitude of the financial war they were initiating. He set the empty cup down, leaned over the desk, and looked directly into her eyes, stripping away the professional distance for just a brief, human moment. He asked her if she was truly all right, his voice carrying the deep, protective weight of a man who had watched her navigate 12 years of an increasingly toxic, dangerous marriage. Victoria looked back at him, her breathing perfectly controlled, her expression as steady and unyielding as granite. She told him honestly that she was not all right, but that she was absolutely going to be. Marcus studied her for a beat, satisfied with the ironclad determination in her voice, and nodded slowly as he stood up to leave. At the door, Marcus paused, his thick hand resting heavily on the brass knob as he remembered one final, critical piece of data. He reminded her that Vanessa Collins was fully detailed in the private research file he had placed on her desk 6 weeks ago. Victoria confirmed that she had thoroughly read the file, knowing about all three of Vanessa's meteoric corporate promotions within the Blackwood investment firms, the highly inflated performance reviews that supported those rapid advancements, and the explicit signature of Damian Blackwood that sat at the bottom of every single one of those corporate documents. Marcus looked down at the floorboards, a brief flash of hesitation crossing his rugged features as he noted that Vanessa might not actually know the full, predatory picture of what Damien was setting her up for. Victoria nodded her dark head in slow, calculated agreement. She told Marcus that she knew Vanessa was merely an instrument in Damien's grand design. That was precisely why her name was in the legal file. But she was absolutely not the target of the destruction that was about to unfold. Once Marcus left the study, Victoria turned back to her computer, completely oblivious to the fact that her black coffee was growing stone cold on the desk beside her. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, finalizing the digital trap doors that would snap shut across Manhattan at 9 o'clock sharp. As she worked in the absolute silence of the early morning, her mind drifted to the acoustic patterns she had heard hours earlier through the floorboards. Damien had slept until exactly 9:30 a.m., which was significantly later than his usual rigid schedule, a distinct behavioral signal that told her he had been drinking heavily in the dark after she had walked away from him in the foyer. She had lain awake in the dark of her bedroom, listening intently to the specific percussion of a man moving recklessly through a large, empty house. She had heard the soft click of the heavy liquor cabinet opening in the library, followed by the heavier, aggressive slam of the door closing. She had felt absolutely nothing she was willing to name as she listened to those sounds. No grief, no panic, only a cold, systemized countdown. At exactly 9:45 a.m., Victoria closed her laptop and walked down to the sunlit breakfast room, sitting quietly at the table with a plate of toast while reading a dense legal brief on her personal cell phone. Moments later, Damien appeared in the doorway. He was fully dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, but he looked distinctly disheveled in the specific, telling way of powerful men who had slept fitfully in their clothes and mistakenly believed a hot shower and expensive cologne could hide the rot underneath. He stood in the frame for a moment, his bloodshot eyes locked onto her across the long table, his face displaying a subtle, tense recalibration as he assessed her complete lack of emotional fallout from the previous night. Victoria looked up from her phone for a fraction of a second, her expression entirely unreadable, before casually looking back down at her legal text. Damien stepped into the room, his voice low and tight as he noted that she didn't have to spend the entire night hiding in her study. He claimed he had been awake working, using her name with a forced, performative familiarity that made her stomach turn. Instead of remaining standing to maintain the physical dominance he usually favored during corporate confrontations, Damien did something that caught her entirely by surprise. He quietly sat down in the chair directly across from her. He placed his large forearms flat on the wood, leaning forward slightly to project an aura of intimacy and reason. He told her in a soft, low voice that he knew this situation was incredibly hard for her, and that he knew this wasn't the path she wanted, but that he desperately needed to do this the right way by being completely honest with her face to face. Victoria slowly set her piece of toast down, her dark eyes rising to meet his with the force of a tectonic plate shifting. She cut through his rehearsed monologue without a single ounce of heat, pointing out that he had brought his pregnant mistress into their shared home, that he had ordered Raymond Vance to take predatory photographs of her abandoned ring at 4 in the morning, and that he currently had a Chicago crime syndicate consultant stationed in her East Wing, going through her private financial documents. Damien's expression shifted instantly, the calculated mask of the reasonable husband slipping away to reveal the cold, defensive calculation of a mafia boss who had just realized his opponent had a much clearer view of the board than he ever anticipated. Damien leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he asked her a genuine, unvarnished test question. What are you going to do? For all the dramatic performance of the night before, the calculated public humiliation, and the staged entrance, this was the first real, unscripted conversation they had experienced in years. It was the question Damien desperately needed answered so he could calculate exactly how much legal or physical danger he was in. Victoria looked at him for a long, agonizingly silent minute, letting the absolute weight of her presence suffocate the room. She could feel the intense, desperate effort he was putting into reading her face, hunting for any flicker of anger, fear, or resentment that he could use to find an exploit. But there was absolutely nothing to see. Damian Blackwood had built his entire criminal empire on his unique ability to read human weakness. And the sudden, terrifying realization that he could no longer read his own wife was the most dangerous position he had ever stood in. Victoria simply picked up her phone, looked back down at her documents, and said flatly, "I'm going to finish my toast." Damien sat perfectly still for another full 60 seconds, his jaw clenched, entirely paralyzed by the complete absence of any visible reaction. He stood up and left the breakfast room without uttering another syllable, completely unaware that the 9 o'clock deadline had already passed, and the invisible grid of his empire was already beginning to freeze solid beneath his feet. The silence that followed Damien's retreat from the breakfast room did not last long, as the invisible machinery Victoria had set in motion at 9 o'clock sharp began to trigger its first real-world alarms. She sat perfectly still, her half-eaten piece of toast resting on the porcelain plate, while the distant, muffled sound of her husband's voice echoed down the long marble hallway. He was on his phone, his tone dropping into that dangerously low, taut register she had heard 1,000 times before during high-stakes corporate crises, repeating his attorney's name with an increasing sense of hard-pressed urgency. The first formal fracture in Damien's corporate armor manifested precisely at 11:43 a.m., when Victoria's private cell phone vibrated against the dark wood of the table. The screen displayed the name of David Reeves, the ultra-cautious managing director of a prominent real estate investment group in which Damien held a massive 40% stake. David was a 60-year-old veteran of the New York property wars, a man who had survived 3 brutal economic recessions simply by being intensely attentive to the earliest whispered signals of structural instability. The fact that he was bypassing the standard corporate channels and calling Victoria's heavily guarded private line instead of Damien's office was a massive behavioral tell that communicated absolutely everything about the urgency of his errand. Victoria answered without a single ounce of preamble, her voice a calm, smooth interface that gave away absolutely nothing. David didn't waste time with pleasantries. His breathing was shallow, his words clipped as he demanded to know exactly what was happening with the Hendricks Avenue property. He explained that Raymond Vance had called his office an hour prior, aggressively demanding an immediate, total transfer of signature authority on the property's primary operating account directly to Damien, bypassing the Sterling Blackwood Management Trust entirely. Victoria listened intently, her dark eyes tracking the pale winter sunlight as it crawled across the breakfast room floor. David paused, waiting for a reaction, before revealing that he had just pulled the original, ironclad trust documentation from his private safe. He pointed out that the foundational bylaws explicitly required Victoria's physical co-signature for any structural authority transfers to take effect. He noted with a tremor of nervous agitation that Raymond either genuinely didn't know that specific clause existed, or he was desperately hoping David wouldn't look hard enough to check. Victoria asked him directly which scenario he believed it was, her tone completely devoid of emotional bias. A long, heavy silence stretched over the digital line as David calculated the immense legal risks of the situation. He admitted quietly that he believed the attorney knew exactly what he was doing, and that he was actively hoping the firm would process the transfer quickly in the morning chaos before anyone bothered to scrutinize the paperwork. Victoria's response was an explicit, unyielding directive: do not process it. David let out a ragged breath, admitting that he had already flagged the transaction, but the sheer panic in his voice betrayed a deeper, structural terror. He asked her straight out how bad this situation was going to get for the rest of their shared holdings. Victoria told him calmly that the ultimate legal outcome remained unclear, but she strongly recommended that his firm immediately conduct an exhaustive review of their entire financial exposure across every single shared venture before the end of the business week. She could hear the heavy, slow exhale of a seasoned businessman, realizing the ground beneath his feet was liquefying. David hesitated, his voice dropping to a cautious whisper as he asked if the current chaos was directly connected to what he referred to as the Chicago situation. Victoria paused, her analytical mind instantly noting the term, and asked him exactly what he knew about that particular operation. David retreated instantly into corporate deniability, muttering that he knew very little, certainly nothing he was willing to articulate on an unencrypted phone line. Victoria didn't push him. She merely repeated her stark warning to review his exposure and told him to call his personal litigation attorneys before the sun went down. The moment she hung up, the floodgates opened. By 12 o'clock noon, 4 more urgent calls had flooded her private line, 2 of them from prominent Manhattan business associates, running variations of the exact same desperate errand David Reeves had just described. Raymond Vance was clearly orchestrating a frantic, uncoordinated blitzkrieg across the city, making rapid, aggressive attempts to move liquid assets, transfer corporate authority, and shift the structural landscape of the Blackwood fortune before Victoria's legal teams could fully stabilize the grid. The third call was significantly different. Coming from Patricia Huang, a powerful director on the Charitable Foundation Board, who spent 10 minutes asking highly polished, carefully worded questions about the current status of Victoria's directorship and whether any impending personal matters might impact the foundation's public branding. Victoria handled the corporate doublespeak with moving precision, reassuring Patricia while cementing her own position as the undisputed anchor of the charity's credibility. But it was the final notification that truly altered the geometry of her day, a call from an unlisted, blocked number that she deliberately let slide straight to voicemail. Victoria didn't listen to it in the house. She grabbed her heavy winter coat, walked out to the staff parking area, and slipped into the front seat of her sedan. With the engine idling and the vehicle's heating unit turned up to shield her from the brutal midday freeze, she pressed her phone to her ear to play the audio file. The voice that emerged from the speaker belonged to a woman named Dr. Claire Lawson, who identified herself as the senior attending physician at New York Presbyterian Hospital. It was the exact medical professional who had treated Victoria during her agonizing 1-week hospitalization 3 years ago. The Dr. S recorded message was short, clinical, and entirely unexpected. She stated precisely that a highly sensitive matter had just come to her personal attention that she believed Miss Blackwood had an absolute right to know about. She requested an immediate callback on a secure line, stating with immense professional caution that the matter directly concerned her husband and certain highly unusual communications he had made to the medical staff during her intensive care. Dr. Lawson emphasized that she wanted to be exceptionally careful about how she shared this data, begging Victoria to call her back without delay. Victoria sat perfectly still in the warm car, her eyes staring blankly at the gray, slush-covered Manhattan street through the frosted windshield. Instead of calling the hospital back immediately, she dialed Marcus Webb first. The moment he answered, before she could even utter a syllable, Marcus interrupted her, his deep voice carrying a rare, somber weight. He told her flatly that he already knew about the physician, admitting that he was preparing to break the news to her himself. Victoria's grip tightened on the steering wheel as she demanded to know exactly how long he had possessed this information. Marcus confessed that he had known for 2 days, explaining that he had received a separate, highly confidential inquiry through a secure personal contact stationed within the hospital's administrative hierarchy. Someone within Damien's inner circle had been asking quiet, back-channel questions about whether Damien had ever successfully managed to access Victoria's private, permanent medical records during that specific treatment period 3 years ago. Victoria continued to stare out at the bleak February street. A lone woman was struggling to push a stroller through the heavy, gray slush on the sidewalk. Further down the block, 2 construction workers in bright hard hats were quietly eating sandwiches in front of a heavily scaffolded building. The normal, mundane world was continuing to function all around her as if nothing had changed. While inside her vehicle, the structural reality of her entire life was being systematically rewritten. She asked Marcus flatly if Damien had been trying to ascertain her long-term prognosis. Marcus did not flinch from the ugly truth, stating that it wasn't a question, but an absolute operational certainty based on his tracking. He reminded her that 3 years ago, the medical team had left her with an uncertain, terrifying diagnosis for about 6 weeks before they finally cleared her. During those exact 6 weeks of terrifying ambiguity, there was extensive documentary evidence to believe that Damien was making active, sweeping financial preparations behind her back. Victoria felt the air leave her lungs, her voice a flat, hollow whisper as she forced Marcus to say the words out loud. asking if her husband had been making preparations for the specific contingency in which she did not recover. Marcus answered with extreme care, using the sterile language of a risk manager to describe a monstrous act of betrayal. He confirmed that Damien was measuring the situation privately, circumventing her entirely to discover exactly what his legal and financial position would be if she died. He wanted to ensure that her family's historic assets would root directly into his corporate control without being intercepted by her mother's surviving estate structure. Marcus fell silent, letting the absolute horror of the data sit heavily in the warm air between them. The slush outside had begun to refreeze in the dropping afternoon temperature, the wet surface turning dull, jagged, and crystalline. Victoria hung up the phone without another word and immediately dialed Dr. Lawson's private office. The conversation that followed lasted for 40 grueling minutes, a steady clinical recitation of times, dates, and explicit verbal inquiries that Damien had made while Victoria lay semi-conscious in a hospital bed. When the call finally ended, a strange, unnatural transformation occurred within Victoria's posture. Her hands on the steering wheel were completely steady. Her breathing through her nose was entirely controlled and rhythmic, somewhere deep behind her sternum. A sensation manifested for which she did not possess a precise legal word. It felt remarkably like the final, heavy lock of a massive structure clicking flawlessly into place. It was the precise feeling an investigator gets when they uncover the absolute last piece of forensic evidence that transforms an elegant working theory into an undeniable, devastating fact. Damien had never seen her as a partner. He had seen her as a temporary asset with an expiration date he was desperately hoping to calculate. She put the sedan into gear and drove out of the parking area, navigating the frozen Manhattan grid with a fierce, dangerous focus. She had a mandatory strategic meeting scheduled for 3 o'clock with the independent litigation attorneys she had retained in absolute secrecy 18 months ago. She had selected a firm that possessed absolutely zero professional or social connections to any of Damien's vast corporate associates, paying their substantial retainers out of her private, inherited funds. She had never uttered their names to Damien, nor had she ever left a single digital trace of their existence on the house servers. She arrived at the Midtown office building precisely 41 minutes early, parking her car in a dark, subterranean garage before riding the elevator up to their high-security suite. The litigation attorneys were birth sisters Elena and Sophie Marchetti, a unique detail Victoria hadn't known when she initially vetted them, but one she had found deeply reassuring once she discovered it. They were both elite graduates of Columbia Law, boasting 12 and 9 years of high-stakes practice respectively, with legendary reputations for deploying a kind of sustained, methodical, and crushing psychological pressure that opposing corporate counsel found deeply uncomfortable to endure. Elena, the older sister at 46, was dark-eyed, elegant, and chillingly precise. She possessed the demeanor of a high-level chess master who routinely prepared 3 times more thoroughly for a deposition than she would ever actually need to be. Sophie was younger, lighter, and possessed sharper predatory instincts, the rare ability to read a closed room-esque hidden power architecture in a matter of seconds and exploit a witness's unvocalized fear. Together, the Marchetti sisters operated with the seamless, devastating efficiency of a dual processor system designed to complement each other's lethal strengths. Victoria sat across from them in a stark, glass-walled conference room that offered a sweeping view of the gray February sky, though the building's exterior bore absolutely no signage to indicate the high-stakes warfare that occurred inside. She did not waste time on emotion. In approximately 8 minutes, her voice level and flat, she laid out the exact events of the previous 17 hours with clinical precision, before sliding a sleek, encrypted USB drive across the polished wood table. She told them calmly that everything they needed from this point forward was contained on that drive. It held 3 full years of exhaustive documentation, explicit property deeds, trust structures, the hidden holding company architecture, meticulous financial forensics on 6 of Damien's primary partnerships, encrypted communications, and now, the complete, documented testimony of Dr. Claire Lawson regarding his medical inquiries. Elena reached out a manicured hand and picked up the drive, weighing it in her palm as if she could physically gauge the immense destructive power contained within the digital files. She noted calmly that Damien had introduced unauthorized occupants into the east wing of the West 74th property. Sophie leaned forward instantly, her sharp eyes flashing as she uttered a single, decisive legal word: trespassing. She looked directly at Victoria, explaining that since the real estate title was legally held by Victoria S. Private Trust, the overnight occupancy initiated by Damien without her explicit written consent constituted a clear, actionable civil trespass. She stated aggressively that they could have a formal notice of eviction delivered to the mansion by the police department before 5 o'clock that very afternoon. Not yet, Victoria said, her voice dropping into a register that made both sisters freeze. She explained with calculated coldness that she wanted Damien, Vanessa, and Vincent Reel to remain exactly where they were in the East Wing for the time being. She wanted the Chicago consultant to continue sitting at that mahogany desk, spending every single minute reviewing those corporate documents inside a building that he mistakenly believed belonged to his employer. Every second he spent constructing a defensive strategy was a minute entirely wasted, because his entire case was building upon a foundation of facts that were completely inaccurate. Elena set the USB drive back down onto the table, a slow, predatory understanding spreading across her sharp features. She asked Victoria quietly if she was intentionally letting them commit to their strategy. "I want them to build their entire defense around a foundation that isn't there," Victoria answered, her dark eyes reflecting the harsh overhead lights of the conference room. "And then, I want to remove the foundation." Elena and Sophie exchanged a brief, highly calibrated look of professional admiration. The trap was total, elegant, and crushing. Elena leaned forward, her pen hovering over a yellow legal pad as she asked for the exact date of execution. Victoria thought back to Damien as arrogant, bloodshot face in the breakfast room, remembering the genuine fear hidden beneath his question when he asked what she was going to do. She looked straight at her attorneys and gave them their deadline: Thursday. The countdown had officially begun, and Damien Blackwood was running out of time. The drive back to the estate from the Midtown conference room was executed in absolute, suffocating darkness, the late afternoon sun having vanished early behind the jagged Manhattan skyline. The temperature had dropped even lower, plunging well past the single digits, causing the slush-filled streets to empty out completely, as foot traffic thinned to only those souls who possessed an absolute, unavoidable necessity to be outside. Victoria sat behind the wheel of her idling sedan at a bright red light on Columbus Avenue, her dark eyes tracking a lone man in a heavy woolen coat who was struggling to restrain a large dog. The animal was straining violently against its thick leather leash, twisting and pulling towards something unseen in the deep shadows just beyond the reach of the flickering street lamps. The sight triggered a distant, hollow echo in her mind, causing her to think deeply about the 12 long years she had spent standing in rooms just like that shadow managing pristine appearances, making herself quietly indispensable to the complex architecture of Damien Blackwood's life, and foolishly believing her immense patience possessed a noble, protective purpose. She had been entirely right about the necessity of her patience, but as the chilling discoveries of the day proved, she had been tragically wrong about his purpose. When the light snapped to green, she drove the final blocks to West 74th Street, pulling into the private drive with a smooth, practiced deceleration. From the pavement, she could see that the expansive East Wing was completely illuminated, its tall, historic windows casting long rectangles of amber light across the frozen, dead grass of the courtyard. Through the glass of the second floor, a sharp, steady silhouette moved rhythmically back and forth. Vincent Reel, the Chicago crime syndicate's financial architect, was still actively at work inside her property. He had been hunched over Damien's private ledgers for 9 consecutive hours now, assembling a strategic picture of the Blackwood Empire's assets. Victoria parked the car, slipped her keys into her pocket, and walked through the side entrance that Marcus Webb had deliberately left unlocked for her. Marcus met her instantly in the shadows of the entry hall, his large frame rigid, his face a grave mask, as he reported that Raymond Vance had already called her private line twice from an unlisted number, leaving a frantic message stating that an urgent, confidential meeting was required before the sun went down. Victoria adjusted her coat, her voice dropping into a flat, icy register as she commanded Marcus to tell the attorney Friday. Marcus hesitated briefly, noting that Vance had explicitly stressed the matter absolutely could not wait. But Victoria merely repeated the directive with ironclad finality, telling him to command Raymond to bring his own defense counsel to the table. Once Marcus left to relay the message, Victoria began to climb the grand staircase, but her steps faltered slightly as Marcus called up to her from the bottom of the steps, reporting that Vanessa Collins had emerged from the East Wing at precisely 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The pregnant mistress had stood entirely alone in the dim, drafty East Corridor for nearly 10 agonizing minutes, her hands clasped tightly over her stomach, looking around the massive house as if desperately wanting to speak to someone, before she ultimately panicked and retreated back into her isolation. Victoria paused on the steps, the heavy silk of her blouse catching the dim light of the chandelier, as she asked Marcus flatly if the staff was ensuring Vanessa was eating properly. Marcus looked up from his notepad, a flicker of surprise crossing his rugged features, prompting Victoria to remind him with quiet precision that the woman was 8 months pregnant. She commanded him to ensure proper food was brought up to the guest suite immediately, a directive Marcus accepted with a slow, respectful nod before disappearing into the back of the house. Victoria finally reached her bedroom, closed the heavy oak door behind her, and sat down on the edge of the mattress. She did not kick off her shoes, nor did she illuminate the room. She simply sat in the absolute, freezing darkness and allowed herself exactly 11 minutes to feel the full, crushing weight of everything she had actively refused to feel since the moment she pulled her diamond ring off her finger. It was an agonizing, deeply unpleasant experience, not the clean, predictable grief of a tragic ending, but the sickening, hollow devastation of watching a person you had loved for a decade slowly reveal his true shape beneath the layers of a beautifully choreographed lie. Damien had never been real. The love she had given him was entirely genuine, but the man she had given it to was nothing more than a predatory illusion. The realization was a specific, jagged wound that didn't care about her meticulous legal documentation or her brilliant corporate strategy. When the 11th minute expired on her watch, she stood up, walked to the bathroom to splash freezing water onto her face, and returned to her desk. There were 14 urgent client messages waiting on her encrypted server. She methodically responded to 12 of them with clinical precision, leaving the final 2 for Thursday morning. Because on Thursday, the grid was going to freeze. The authority would shift. And Vincent Rio was going to open a digital file that would tell him exactly who owned the building he was sitting in at exactly 11:48 p.m. Just as Victoria was preparing to close her laptop, her phone began to vibrate violently against the mahogany wood. The incoming call displayed a completely blocked, untraceable number, and under normal circumstances, she would have let it slide straight to voicemail. But a sudden, sharp survival instinct, the highly localized alertness of a person who had finally decided to stop protecting herself from the ugly realities she already knew, made her slide her finger across the glass to answer. The masculine voice that emerged from the speaker was low, intensely careful, and entirely unfamiliar to her ears. He addressed her explicitly as Miss Sterling, pointedly omitting her married name, before introducing himself as Special Agent Frank Caruso of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Caruso wasted no time on pleasantries, revealing with chilling calm that his organized financial crimes division had been secretly monitoring her husband's corporate network for 26 consecutive months. Victoria sat remarkably still, her spine freezing against the back of her chair as Caruso paused, waiting for her reaction. When she told him flatly that she already knew quite a lot about Damien's operations, the agent responded with a heavy, somber validation, stating that the Bureau was fully aware of her activities. But it was his next sentence that completely altered the gravity of the night. Caruso stated with immense urgency that the Bureau had just intercepted high-level encrypted communications, indicating that Damien had discovered the full extent of her documentation. And they had credible reason to believe that within the next 48 hours, the Mafia boss was going to move aggressively to neutralize any and all surviving witnesses who posed a direct threat to his empire. Victoria's breath caught in her throat, her voice a flat whisper as she repeated the word witnesses. Caruso confirmed the term with clinical finality, clarifying that the immediate threat category included Victoria herself, Marcus Webb, and potentially Dr. Claire Lawson at New York Presbyterian Hospital. Victoria looked down at her glowing laptop screen, viewing the vast digital architecture of the defense case she had spent 3 grueling years building from inside the very monster she was documenting every transaction, every illegal wire transfer, every fraudulent signature laid out in flawless, devastating order. She asked Caruso, though, with absolute calm exactly when he wanted to meet. The agent's response was instantaneous. Tonight, right now if possible. Victoria stood up immediately, walking over to the window to look down at the illuminated east wing where Real S. Shadow was still pacing against the glass, and commanded Caruso to give her an address. She grabbed a scrap of scrap paper, rapidly scrawled the location onto the back of an envelope, and stared at the ink for 3 seconds before grabbing her heavy winter coat and walking out into the freezing night, completely prepared to face whatever terrors were waiting for her in the shadows of the city. The address Agent Caruso had given her was a multi-level parking garage on West 46th Street, a bleak, utilitarian monolith of poured concrete and stale exhaust that stood as a monument to pure machinery in the heart of Midtown Manhattan. Victoria drove herself, navigating the icy grid with a fierce, dangerous focus, deliberately ignoring the intense protests of Marcus Webb, who had spent the brief 2 minutes before her departure trying to insert himself or a security detail into her vehicle. She had left Marcus with an ironclad directive. If she was not back by 2 o'clock in the morning, he was to immediately call Elena Marchetti and instruct her to open the high-security package left inside the office safe. Now, sitting on the deserted fourth level in Bay D, with her engine idling to provide a meager shield against the sub-zero temperature, she watched her rearview mirror as a figure materialized from the dense shadows of a concrete support column. It was Caruso, a man in his late platform 40s, whose thin coat suggested he had traveled from a warmer climate in an absolute rush. He held up his federal credentials against her frosted window, his face etched with the permanent, deep-set tension of an operative who spent his life deciphering the violent discrepancies between what wealthy men showed to the world and what they actually were. Refusing Caruso's request to step out into the freezing, shadow-choked garage, Victoria rolled her window down just an inch, forcing the agent to crouch to eye level as the engine's exhaust swirled around them. Caruso didn't waste time on pleasantries. His voice was a flat, clinical vibration as he revealed that Damian Blackwood had been the primary target of a massive federal financial crimes investigation since 2022. The Bureau had compiled an ironclad file detailing wire fraud, extensive money laundering, and deep conspiracy charges linking Damian's corporate entities directly to 3 separate criminal organizations. One of those networks, Caruso confirmed, was based entirely in Chicago. They had Damian caught on wiretaps. They had him documented in closed rooms, and they possessed a mountain of financial flow data that would easily secure an indictment on its own. But as Caruso paused, his breath forming thick plumes of white vapor in the dark, he admitted there was a critical, volatile problem named Vincent Riel. The name triggered a sharp, localized alignment in Victoria's memory, connecting the generic Chicago consultant Damian had introduced 18 months ago to the dangerous asset architect currently locking down her East Wing. Caruso's eyes sharpened through the glass as he revealed that Riel was the supreme financial fixer for the Chicago syndicate, having moved illicit capital through shell companies for 8 years, 3 of which shared a direct, documented relationship with Damian's private holdings. The gravity of the night shifted violently as Caruso admitted the true reason for his midnight summons. The Bureau had just intercepted high-level data, suggesting that Riel had not traveled to New York merely to audit books. He had arrived because a catastrophic leak within the operational pipeline had informed him that Victoria possessed a devastating archive of documentation that made her an immediate, fatal liability to both Damian and the Chicago organization. Damian had known she was collecting evidence for at least 6 months, and the public display of bringing his pregnant mistress into the home was a calculated trap designed to shatter her emotional control, forcing her out into the open away from her security detail so they could monitor, preempt, and ultimately neutralize her before she could hand her files to federal authorities. Caruso admitted the Bureau had known about her private archive for 6 weeks, waiting to see if she would attempt to protect her husband or use her network to dismantle him. Victoria's response was an icy, unyielding baseline. She turned her dark eyes to the agent and reminded him that people do not spend 3 years meticulously structuring independent trusts and documenting systemic misconduct to protect a monster. Caruso didn't flinch, ordering her to return to the mansion, maintain the flawless interface of a wife managing a personal domestic crisis, and give the Bureau exactly 24 hours to secure an emergency protective order to freeze Riel's ability to act. Victoria drove back to West 74th Street, arriving at 1:47 a.m., to find the East Wing lights still burning with a defiant, predatory brightness. She slipped through the side door, bypassed the main corridors entirely, and sat in the freezing darkness of her bedroom until exhaustion finally claimed her mind. She woke precisely at 6:15 a.m. to the low, distinct percussion of voices carrying up the architectural channels of the old stairwell, rising silently. She stood near the threshold of her door, her analytical mind immediately identifying the flat, informational quality of Vincent Reel's voice as he delivered a sequence of data to Damien. Reel was reporting that the Hendricks Avenue operating account had been entirely locked by noon. The change of authority requests had been flatly declined by the property management firms, and the asset flow was completely frozen. Damien snapped, dismissing it as the panicked, desperate reaction of a frightened woman, but Reel cut him off with a chilling. Clinical assessment. This is not a scared person. Damien, a scared person liquidates and runs. She's not liquidating anything. She's locking the structure in place. The real structural explosion occurred seconds later when Rio revealed the devastating results of the title search he had executed during his midnight vigil. With absolute, flat finality, the Chicago fixer informed the mafia boss that the very house they were standing in was no longer his to control. The chain of title had been systematically transferred 14 months ago into an independent entity called Sterling Family Holdings LLC, processed directly under the nose of his own legal team. The silence that followed was heavy, toxic, and absolute. Before Damien's voice emerged, stripped of all its constructed arrogance, dropping into a terrifyingly flat register as he realized his wife had entirely disarmed him within his own fortress. Victoria heard the heavy scraping of a glass object being violently hatted off a surface downstairs, followed by Damien's hoarse command to get Raymond Cho on the phone immediately despite the pre-dawn hour. She walked calmly into her bathroom, turned on the shower, and let the steaming water wash over her as the first major wall of Damien's empire began to collapse into the frozen ground below. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the fallout reached the breakfast room. Victoria sat quietly drinking her coffee when Raymond Cho appeared in the doorway, his usual sharp, calculated corporate posture replaced by a profound, shaken stillness. He had spent the morning hours at the mansion realizing that the routine restructuring documents Damien had forced him to process over the last 6 months carried a vastly different, potentially criminal effect than what had been represented to him. Raymond sat across from her, his voice dropping to a private, heavily guarded whisper as he admitted his severe exposure to a bar inquiry and a federal conspiracy charge connected to the Chicago network. He looked at Victoria with a raw, unexpected honesty, revealing that Vincent Reel's presence in the house was never about a standard financial audit. Damien had summoned the Chicago fixer weeks before Vanessa's arrival because he intended to deploy a different category of violence to resolve his liabilities. Raymond stated with absolute clarity that he was filing a formal notice of withdrawal from Damien's representation that very morning, citing irreconcilable conflicts, and offered to make his internal documentation available to Victoria's teams through proper legal channels. Victoria studied the veteran lawyer, recognizing the strategic value of his defection, and calmly instructed him to file his papers immediately and contact Sophie Marchetti, who would safely orchestrate the transfer of his data. As Raymond stood to button his jacket, he looked at her with a heavy trace of professional awe, muttering that Damien had never truly understood the caliber of the woman he had married, a statement Victoria accepted with a cold, final nod. At 10 o'clock sharp, Damien found her standing near the stone wall of the frozen bear garden. The fountain was covered. The earth was black with cold, and as the mafia boss approached across the dead grass, he looked, for the very first time in the 14 years she had known him, like a man who was actively losing his momentum. He stopped 2 feet away, his jaw clenched, his eyes bloodshot from the drinking and the sheer panic of the morning's discoveries. He demanded to know what outcome she was looking for from this war. Victoria looked at his face, completely untamed by the tears or hysteria he had counted on to make her careless. Her voice a level, structural force as she told him. She wanted her actual life back, the one she had paused in year 6 when she first uncovered the criminal rot beneath his facade. She openly mocked his calculated attempt to use Vanessa as a weapon against her pride, stating flatly that his grand strategy was entirely transparent. She stepped closer, her dark eyes locking onto his as she forced him to answer the ultimate, terrifying question. How long had he been actively communicating with the Chicago syndicate about how to manage the problem of his wife? Damien looked away, his gaze falling to the dead stone wall, before his jaw tightened and he whispered the devastating truth. 3 months. He tried to stammer a defense, claiming it wasn't what she thought. But Victoria cut through the lie with clinical precision, articulating his exact plan to use the 48-hour window to compromise her legal standing and force her to accept ruinous terms. Damien's hoarse voice confirmed that Riel already knew enough to act on the data. Realizing the absolute physical danger her team was now in, Victoria pulled out her phone, dialed Agent Caruso on the first ring, and delivered the critical baseline that would snap the federal trap shut. He knows about the documentation. Caruso, and the timeline just changed. We need to move right now. The heavy freight elevator of the converted Chelsea garment factory ricked and groaned as it ascended, the mechanical shutter vibrating through the soles of Victoria S. boots with a cold, industrialized cadence. Beside her stood the two young field agents Agent Caruso had deployed as an emergency escort Reyes, and Decker, their bodies rigid, their eyes systematically scanning the shifting floor numbers and the heavy iron gate with the self-conscious alertness of operatives who hadn't entirely mastered the art of being invisible. When the lift finally shuddered to a halt on the fourth floor, the metallic gate slid open to reveal a long, sterile corridor flooded with the harsh, buzzing hum of institutional fluorescent lighting. Victoria stepped out without a trace of hesitation, her keys already gripped tightly in her hand. This storage unit, legally registered under her late mother Eleanor Sterling's name 12 years ago, was the singular architectural anchor she had deliberately left untouched by the Blackwood corporate apparatus. It contained the physical soul of her 4-year defensive investigation, notarized instruments, original signed corporate deeds, written medical testimonies, and thick paper records of every illicit transaction Damien had ever authorized. It was her ultimate bunker, a sanctuary she had built with mathematical precision. Yet somewhere deep within her sternum, a cold drop of dread condensed. Despite all her calculated preparation, she realized that at the deepest, most vulnerable layer of her subconscious, she had never truly believed Damien would possess the monstrous capability to hunt her down to this specific geographic coordinate. She reached Unit 441, her fingers moving flawlessly across the lockpad to enter the combination she had never once committed to paper. The heavy metal door swung open with a hollow, echoing scrape, and Victoria reached into the darkness to illuminate the overhead bulb, only to freeze mid-motion as the dim light flooded the narrow space. The internal geography of the unit had been violated. Against the left wall stood a massive, 4-shelf industrial steel rack, an apparatus Victoria had organized over the years with the hyper-focused, uncompromising neatness that was more of an unyielding personality trait than a simple filing system. The boxes had been disturbed. It wasn't the chaotic, destructive vandalism of a common smash-and-grab thief. It was something far more chilling, executed with a quiet, methodical precision that mirrored her own analytical mind. 3 heavy Banker S boxes had been carefully slid out, inspected, and returned to the rack. The sequence was almost correct, but to Victoria's hyper-observant eye, the alignment was fatally off by a fraction of an inch. They had been replaced backward, missing the exact symmetry she had left behind 8 months prior during her last secret audit. Agent Reyes stepped forward instantly, her hand dropping toward her service weapon as her voice sliced through the silence, commanding Victoria not to touch a single surface until forensics could sweep the room. Victoria ignored the warning, her body moving forward in 4 rapid, deliberate steps toward the bottom right shelf. Her eyes scanned the labels. Correspondence 2019 sat pristine. Property Records 2020 was entirely untouched, but her target and unmarked. Heavy brown box that usually occupied the absolute bottom corner had been shifted upward to the second shelf, its raw cardboard surface facing the wrong direction, exposing a tiny, adhesive security label she had placed on the reverse side. She ripped the lid off, her breath catching in her throat as her hands cataloged the remaining files. Dr. Lawson's sworn medical affidavit was there. The West 74th property trust deeds were intact. The chain of title instruments remained entirely undisturbed, but the crown jewel of her entire defensive architecture, the massive 4-year communications archive containing every intercepted text, encrypted email, an internal wire memo between Damien and the Chicago Sin Syndicate had been completely eradicated from the box. The realization washed through her veins like sub-zero river water, numbing her skin but instantly sharpening the focus of her thoughts. This wasn't a robbery designed to blind her. It was a highly calculated, terrifying psychological message. Perpetrators knew exactly what the archive contained. They knew it was the single piece of evidence that bridged the gap between civil asset protection and a fatal criminal conspiracy. By leaving the deeds and taking only the communications, they were letting her know that her carefully manufactured advantage had just been entirely neutralized, leaving her exposed to a counterstrike she hadn't engineered a defense for. 40 minutes later, the narrow concrete corridor outside the unit was choked with the oppressive, bureaucratic tension of a federal crime scene. Special Agent Frank Caruso arrived flanked by two senior field agents and a forensic technician who immediately went to work with ultraviolet wands and chemical brushes, sweeping the metal handles for latent prints. Victoria stood against the cold plaster wall, observing the frantic activity with the detached, surreal sensation of someone watching a high-stakes play in which they were simultaneously the central author and completely irrelevant to the mechanics of the stage. Caruso stepped away from the doorway, his face twisted into an expression of unmanaged frustration that was far too raw to be simulated. He confirmed that the breach was fresh, executed within the last 8 hours, well before she had fled the mansion, and long before his office had initiated the midnight summons. Victoria leaned her head back against the stone, her voice a flat, dangerous vibration as she stated the obvious. The breach wasn't a frantic reaction to Vincent Riel discovering the title deeds in her study. The syndicate already possessed the location of her bunker before the confrontation even began. She looked Caruso directly in the eyes, forcing him to acknowledge the rot inside his own pipeline, demanding to know exactly how long his federal investigation had been compromised. Caruso ran a heavy hand over his face, admitting with absolute, unperformed rage that his division was currently auditing internal data flows from the last 72 hours. But the leak was active, contained to a terrifyingly short list of operatives who possessed access to her file. Victoria summarized the catastrophe with clinical detachment. If the Bureau's operational timeline had been compromised, Gregor Szabo's organization in Chicago now possessed absolute visibility over the federal witness list, the evidentiary files, and the structural geometry of the entire criminal prosecution. Caruso didn't deny the worst-case scenario. Instead, he reached into the breast pocket of his trench coat and pulled out a single sheet of folded paper, holding it out like a physician presenting a terminal diagnosis. He revealed that after their midnight meeting in the garage, he had run an exhaustive forensic sweep on Damien S., intercepted communications from Monday afternoon 24 hours before the grand confrontation in the foyer. The paper was a highly sensitive transcript of a 42-minute call between Damien and a notorious opposition researcher named Lester Haynes, a specialist who routinely executed dark money asset tracking and illegal wiretapping for the syndicate's top tier. Victoria took the paper, her eyes tracking the typed text as a profound, physical chill settled deep into her bones, her body recognizing the horror of the data long before her legal mind could fully process the tactical implications. Damien hadn't discovered her investigation 6 weeks ago through a casual accounting error. Haynes had been running a scorched earth background operation on Marcus Webb for 6 consecutive months, intercepting every encrypted phone call, financial transfer, and digital interaction between the estate manager and Victoria. Her eyes locked onto a specific paragraph near the middle of the page. Damien possessed an ironclad, authentic audio recording of a highly detailed phone call from March of the previous year, a conversation in which Victoria and Marcus had meticulously discussed the exact legal structures, corporate shell companies, and trust mechanisms they were utilizing to shift the Blackwood marital assets out of Damien's reach. Caruso's voice dropped to a low, clinical tone, explaining the devastating legal reality. If that recording was entered into a civil or criminal court in isolation, completely stripped of the context of Damien S. underworld activity, it wouldn't look like a defensive asset installation. It would look like an explicit, premeditated conspiracy to commit massive marital asset fraud, executed by Victoria through the illicit utilization of a long-term household employee. Victoria let the paper slip against the wall, her mind rearranging the pieces of the puzzle into a shape that was horrifyingly complete. The introduction of Vanessa, the calculated Sinuke in the foyer. The presence of Vincent Riel, none of it was a reactive, panicked response to her locking the accounts. It was a beautifully engineered trap. Damien wanted her to fight back. He had spent 6 months waiting for her to activate her legal teams because the very act of fighting back would trigger the deployment of the recording. And now, with the communications archive stolen from her storage unit, she no longer possessed the raw, physical evidence required to prove that her asset transfers were defensive responses to documented criminal misconduct. Without those texts, she would stand before a federal judge looking like the primary aggressor, trapped in a multi-year civil defense, while Damien town-turned and liquefied whatever assets remained, routing them into untraceable offshore accounts deep within the Sabo network. Caruso stepped closer, his shadow blotting out the harsh light of the corridor as he delivered an ultimatum. He told her straight out that the federal protection grid was fracturing under the weight of the internal leak if she wanted to pull back, accept whatever predatory settlement terms Damien's lawyers offered, and disappear into witness protection with her remaining funds. The Bureau would facilitate the exit. Victoria looked past him into the empty, violated storage unit, seeing the phantom shape of her mother Eleanor sitting at that old kitchen table in Dayton, holding multiple complex threads in her mind without ever letting a single one drop. She turned her dark eyes back to the federal agent, her voice an absolute, unyielding baseline of iron as she told him no. She stated with fierce, calculated certainty that she had spent 3 years building for this exact war. She hadn't anticipated the loss of the archive, nor had she engineered a defense for a hidden recording. But she had built her entire life on the principle of the truth. She was going to stand at the absolute end of this destruction with nothing but what she actually knew and what she could actually prove. When Caruso asked her what assets she truly had left to fight with, Victoria cataloged her remaining grid with cold efficiency. She had the intact title deeds. She had Raymond Vance's impending defection. She had David Reeves' frozen accounts. She still held Dr. Lawson sworn medical affidavit sitting on the shelf behind her. It was a fragmented, bleeding line of defense, but it was exactly what she had to work with, and she was going to execute it to the millimeter. She pulled out her personal phone and dialed Marcus Webb, the line connecting on the second sharp vibration. Marcus answered instantly, his voice laced with that tight, heavily managed professional calm he always deployed whenever he was trying to shield her from an impending operational catastrophe. Victoria cut through his defense, demanding to know his exact location before asking him flatly about the phone call they had shared in March of the previous year. A long, devastating silence stretched across the digital line, a heavy void that communicated with absolute certainty that Marcus remembered every single syllable of that conversation. Victoria delivered the crushing data without an ounce of heat. Damien had recorded the entire call. Marcus's breathing altered instantly, shifting to the quiet, hyper-controlled rhythm of a veteran operative who had spent his adult life in closed rooms where fates were decided, instantly calculating how the loss of the communications archive transformed that audio file into a fatal conspiracy charge against his own name. He admitted with raw, unmanaged dread that without the archive to contextualize their motives, the recording was catastrophic. For the first time in 9 years of flawless coordination, his voice carried the distinct, heavy vibration of real fear as he realized the true shape of Damien's endgame. The mafia boss wasn't just trying to win a civil real estate dispute. He was deploying a targeted weapon designed to paint Marcus as a criminal co-conspirator, destroying Victoria's greatest operational asset and leaving her entirely isolated before a federal grand jury. "Listen to me, Marcus," Victoria commanded, her voice dropping into a register that brooked no argument as she tracked the sudden escalation of the danger. But Marcus cut her off, his whisper dropping to a low, urgent vibration as he reported that an unidentified, lean man had been standing entirely stationary outside his office building for the last 40 minutes. Victoria spun on her heel, her dark eyes locking onto Agent Caruso as she demanded an immediate tactical protection detail be deployed to the Marchetti law offices. Caruso instantly hit his radio, his voice barking commands into the encrypted network, while Victoria ordered Marcus to stay away from the windows, stay away from the doors, and lock himself inside the private conference room alongside Elena Marchetti. She listened to the heavy click of the lock sliding into place across the line, feeling a single degree of tension leave her chest as she sprinted toward the freight elevator with Decker and Reyes flanking her flanks. As the iron cage ricked down toward the street, Victoria closed her eyes, her analytical mind completely abandoning the loss of the physical archive. Her mother's brain instantly initiated a sweeping calculation of the remaining human elements on the board, her thoughts locking with sudden, predatory focus onto the image of Vanessa Collins, an 8-month pregnant woman currently sitting in an estate that didn't belong to her, completely blind to the fact that the man she loved was using her unborn child as nothing more than a legal battering ram to crack open a trust. Vanessa was the singular asset Damien hadn't engineered a counter-defense for, and Victoria was going to turn her before the sun reached its zenith. The frantic rattle of the Chelsea sidewalk faded into a distant, muted hum as Victoria stepped back into the cabin of her sedan. Her movements fluid and entirely unhurried, despite the tactical collapse catching fire all around her. Behind her, Agent Decker was violently whispering into his encrypted radio, his eyes darting toward Agent Reyes as they scrambled into their secondary support vehicle to maintain their visual tail. Victoria didn't wait for the federal bureaucracy to clear her transit. She pulled smoothly into the mid-morning traffic, her dark eyes reflecting the flat, slate-gray February light that stripped the Manhattan avenues of their usual theatrical glamour. As she navigated the 8 blocks back to West 74th Street, her mind operated with the chilling, detached arithmetic of a structural engineer assessing a building mid-implosion. The theft of the communications archive was a catastrophic operational wound, leaving her dangerously exposed to the fraudulent asset transfer narrative. Damien had spent 6 months preparing with his hidden wiretap. Without those intercepted texts, her defense grid was bleeding. But as she turned the corner onto her street, her thoughts locked onto the singular, uncalculated anomaly remaining on the board: Vanessa Collins. Damien had built his entire strategy around the assumption that Victoria's aristocratic pride would make her careless, expecting her to flee the mansion in a wave of public humiliation. He had engineered a defense for her rage, but he had not engineered a defense for her complete absence of it. Nor had he ever anticipated that she might look at his pregnant mistress and see a vital human asset rather than an adversary. The $12 million estate looked stark and deeply exposed in the raw daylight, its limestone facade lacking the defensive, untouchable grandeur it projected under the cover of darkness. Victoria walked through the front door without a single beat of hesitation, her boot heels striking the marble floor with a rhythmic, unyielding cadence that signaled absolute ownership. She did not glance at the entry table, where her 3-carat diamond ring still sat undisturbed, a small, glittering relic of a 12-year illusion she had already filed away into the past. Flanked by Decker and Reyes, who maintained a tight 6-foot perimeter behind her, she marched directly to the East Wing corridor and knocked twice on the heavy door of the guest suite. A suffocating silence stretched within the hallway before a muted, hesitant movement sounded from behind the wood, and the door swung open to reveal Vanessa Collins. The pristine, executive elegance the younger woman had projected the previous night was entirely gone. She had discarded the long camel coat, wearing instead a loose, dark dress that draped heavily over her advanced pregnancy, her hair tumbling unstyled over her shoulders. Deep, dark shadows shadowed her eyes, tells that had absolutely nothing to do with late-stage pregnancy fatigue and everything to do with the exhausting overnight realization that the ground beneath her feet was dissolving. She stared at Victoria, her eyes wider as she registered the 2 federal operatives stationed in the corridor, her features freezing into that tense, defensive blankness common among people who are terrified of showing exactly how compromised they are. Victoria cut through her stammered defenses before Vanessa could articulate a refusal, her voice dropping into a level, conversational register that carried absolutely zero hostility. She told her flatly that Damien was not in the house, nor was Vincent Riel, clarifying with immense precision that she was not there to initiate a personal scene or demand anything that would cause her harm. She was asking for exactly 20 minutes of her time. Vanessa looked past her at the silent federal agents, then at the sprawling, expensive architecture of the estate, before her shoulders dropped in a slow, defeated gesture and she stepped back to allow Victoria entry. The guest suite was a masterclass in suffocating European luxury, suffocated with dark wood antiques and heavy velvet drapes that Damien had hired a high-priced designer to install 4 years prior under a corporate brief that demanded pure opulence over comfort. Vanessa sat down heavily in a rigid armchair near the tall window, her hands automatically clasped over her stomach as if shielding her child from the room's sudden, predatory drop in temperature. Victoria took the seat directly across from her, her spine perfectly straight, her hands resting flat on her knees. She didn't waste time on preambles, asking Vanessa directly exactly how much Damien had told her about his actual legal and financial intentions for this week. Vanessa kept her eyes fixed on her hands, her voice a low, defensive whisper as she claimed that Damien merely wanted to be completely honest with both of them, wishing to establish a real, transparent future with the baby arriving. She muttered that Damien had assured her the marriage had grown entirely apart, insisting the separation was mutual. Victoria listened with an unblinking, analytical calm, watching a lone pigeon rest on a frozen stone ledge outside the glass, completely indifferent to the corporate warfare vibrating through the room. She asked her flatly if she truly believed that narrative, before systematically unrolling the data from Marcus's research file. Victoria stated precisely that she knew about the 3 rapid corporate promotions within the Blackwood network, the inflated salary structures, and the explicit performance evaluations that carried Damien's signature in the supporting chain of correspondence. She kept her tone entirely informational, stripping the data of any emotional heat or desire to humiliate the younger woman. She explained with clinical clarity that Damien had not elevated her career out of admiration for her corporate ambition. He had meticulously built her professional credibility so she would look legitimate enough to utilize in a high-stakes boardroom filing and a strategic custody structure he had already engineered in secret. Vanessa looked up sharply, her eyes flashing with a mix of defiance and deep, unvocalized terror as Victoria delivered the core, structural truth of Damien's endgame. Victoria explained that Damien was actively preparing to use this pregnancy and the impending arrival of her child. This is a violent legal mechanism to establish an undisputed claim on marital assets that were never genuinely his to control. The introduction of a new heir changed the entire inheritance structure, providing Damien with the necessary standing to mount aggressive legal challenges against the Sterling family trusts and circumvent the property restrictions Victoria had locked into the grid. That was the exact reason Vincent Reel had been brought from Chicago. The child was nothing more than financial leverage to the syndicate. The silence that followed her words was total, heavy, and absolute. Vanessa's jaw went slack, her voice dropping to a flat, hollow vibration as she repeated the word leverage, her hands tightening against her dress. Victoria looked at her with a profound, unvarnished human empathy, saying softly that she was deeply sorry, before remaining entirely silent, granting the younger woman the necessary seconds to absorb the devastating destruction of her illusions. When Vanessa finally spoke again, her voice was entirely stripped of its defensive corporate armor, revealing a younger, harder, and deeply wounded persona underneath the voice of someone who had been ignoring a terrible, lingering intuition for months and was finally hearing it validated out loud. She asked Victoria flatly what she wanted from her. Victoria leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes locking onto Vanessa's with ironclad intensity, demanding access to whatever explicit promises, written letters, or legal agreements Damien had handed her in private rooms. Vanessa stared back at her, asking what would happen to her if she complied. Victoria didn't hesitate, promising with absolute certainty that Vanessa and her child would be completely insulated from the fallout. She revealed that she possessed an independent trust structure that could be legally amended within 48 hours to include ironclad provisions for her son's future, a clean, separate entity that absolutely no one could touch, ensuring his education and life were never contingent on Damien's criminal empire or the impending federal prosecution. Vanessa studied her for a long, agonizing moment, demanding to know if Victoria was executing this massive protection framework strictly for her son. "Not for your child," Victoria answered, her voice dropping into a register of raw, maternal truth that cut through the sterile room. "For the child. He did not choose to be born into a war zone, and he deserves at least one adult in the room making a decision that isn't about power." That landed with the force of a physical blow. Vanessa stared at her, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall, before she stood up with the careful, deliberate movements of a woman navigating the final weeks of exhaustion. She crossed the expensive room to a heavy antique dresser against the far wall, opened the deep bottom drawer, and pulled out a thick, unmarked manila envelope. She held it out to Victoria, her jaw clenched with a sudden, fierce determination as she revealed that Damien had sent her these files before she ever knew of Victoria's existence letters and a private legal agreement they had signed in November. Her voice shook slightly, but her eyes remained rock solid as she muttered that she had kept every single scrap of correspondence because she wasn't stupid. Something had felt structurally wrong for months, and she wanted protection if the situation imploded. Victoria took the heavy envelope, her fingers tracing the paper as her mother's mathematical mind instantly registered the immense tactical value of the asset. She told Vanessa quietly that she was incredibly smart to keep it, validating her survival instinct while explaining that she had merely been handed a highly curated picture by a man who spent his entire life manufacturing them. Vanessa sat back down, her gaze dropping to the floorboards as she whispered a final, terrifying question, asking if Damien was physically dangerous. Victoria adjusted her coat, looking toward the door where Decker and Reyes were waiting, her voice an ironclad guarantee as she told her he was not dangerous to her, not while she was moving her pieces. She commanded Vanessa to gather her things immediately and travel straight to the Marchetti law offices under the direct protection of the federal operatives in the hall, staying there until the final lines of the grid were secured. Vanessa nodded once, a sharp, conclusive movement that signaled she had entirely shifted her position on the board, ready to let the record show the truth. Victoria stepped out into the drafty corridor, the heavy manila envelope clutched tightly against her ribs, when her phone began to vibrate violently in her palm. It was Marcus Webb. She answered before the device could complete its second vibration, her instincts instantly aligning for a secondary shock. Marcus's voice cut through the line, dangerously tight and laced with an unusual, muffled echo that told her he was using his speakerphone inside a large, hollow space. He reported with raw urgency that Damien had just entered the building lobby, accompanied by 3 unidentified men, and was aggressively demanding Marcus by name. Victoria's stomach tightened into an absolute knot as she spun on her heel toward Agent Decker, Clark bearing a command to get Special Agent Caruso on the line immediately. She ordered Marcus to stay completely away from the elevator banks and the stairs, demanding to know if Elena Marchetti was stationed inside the room with him. Marcus confirmed that Elena was there, but noted that Sophie was currently tied up in a court proceeding. Victoria commanded him to lock the heavy office door immediately, listening to the solid metallic click of the deadbolt sliding home across the digital line, which allowed a single degree of suffocating tension to leave her chest. Decker slammed his phone into her hand, Caruso's voice emerging from the speaker with the frantic, rapid-fire cadence of a commander trapped inside a high-intensity operations room. Caruso revealed that Damien had just executed a brilliant, terrifying legal maneuver at exactly 8:00 a.m. that morning, before the Bureau's federal protective orders could clear the registry. Damien's teams had filed an emergency civil order in a state court. The document formally named Marcus Webb as a primary co-respondent in a massive marital asset fraud claim, granting Damien the immediate legal authority to execute an instant document seizure across any and all files in Marcus's physical possession related to the Blackwood estate. Victoria froze in the center of the hallway, the entire malicious beauty of Damien's strategy mapping itself within her mind in the space of a single breath. He had calculated the exact narrow window between her leaving the mansion and the slower, heavier machinery of the federal government beginning to move, by naming Marcus as a fraudulent co-conspirator. The civil order gave Damien the legal right to walk into that office with his muscle and physically confiscate every single forensic file Marcus possessed before Victoria's defense could be legally stamped and made real. She demanded to know if Caruso could halt the execution, her voice an icy baseline. Caruso answered frantically that he needed exactly 20 minutes to get a federal counterorder signed by a senior judge to freeze the state proceeding, but warned that Damien's security team was already moving toward the elevators. Marcus confirmed the movement across the secondary line, stating that they were bypassing the lobby security desk. Victoria cut through Caruso's timeline, telling him flatly that he didn't have 20 minutes. He had exactly 10. She hung up the line, turned her fierce eyes onto Agent Decker, and demanded to know if the lone federal operative stationed in that lobby could physically delay Damien Blackwood from entering the elevator banks for 10 consecutive minutes without exceeding his legal authority. Decker's eyes darted toward Reyes, his jaw clenching as he admitted he could command him to try, instantly hitting his radio to deploy the order. Victoria didn't wait to hear the response. She began sprinting down the grand staircase toward the side door, her mind completely clear of fear, fueled by that raw, nameless bedrock reservoir of survival instinct that only activates when a person has entirely burned through their adrenaline, Decker yelled after her, demanding to know her destination. But she merely threw the words over her shoulder. She was going to the Marchetti office. She stated with a terrifying flat finality that Damien was absolutely not going to execute a document seizure on Marcus Webb in a public building lobby in front of a crowd, not today. She threw herself into the front seat of her sedan before Decker could even finish his warning sentence, hitting the ignition as the engine roared to life. She pulled out of the private drive with a violent acceleration, her dark eyes fixed on the frozen grid ahead. The Marchetti office was exactly 8 blocks away, a distance that midday Manhattan traffic usually stretched into a grueling 12-minute crawl. But she possessed exactly 10 minutes, and she understood the precise, lethal arithmetic of the situation completely. She was driving into the heart of the storm, and she was not going to be late. The midtown traffic was a grueling wall of yellow cabs and commercial trucks, but Victoria navigated the chaos with the cold, systemized precision of an elite driver who understood the exact structural arithmetic of the situation. Her phone rattled incessantly against the hands-free console, casting the frantic, rapid-fire voice of Special Agent Frank Caruso into the sedan S cabin. He barked across the line that he had finally managed to get an emergency federal counterorder in front of a senior judge, but he desperately required 4 more minutes to get the document officially signed, stamped, and entered into the legal registry. Victoria adjusted her grip on the steering wheel, her dark eyes reflecting the harsh glare of a yellow traffic light that was rapidly shifting to a definitive red. She slammed her foot onto the accelerator, blowing through the intersection as a trailing cab violently honked its horn behind her. She didn't hear it. Her analytical mind was entirely occupied with a rapid-fire calculation of the legal timeline. She asked Caruso flatly to identify the primary attorney of record who had noped the emergency civil filing on Damien S. behalf at 8 o'clock that morning. Caruso stammered that he didn't have the paperwork directly in front of him, but Victoria's voice remained an icy, unyielding baseline as she forced him to run the logic. Raymond Vance had officially filed his structural withdrawal at approximately 8:15 a.m., meaning someone within Damien's hidden network had to have processed this aggressive counterstrike in the narrow window right before that defection cleared the system. The realization materialized across the line like a sudden drop in pressure as Caruso frantically confirmed the connection. The filing had not been engineered by a standard domestic law firm. It had been routed directly through an elite New York legal team deeply connected to Gregor Szabo's criminal network in Chicago. Victoria didn't waste a single syllable on panic. She ordered Caruso to immediately file the explicit connection between Szabo's syndicate and Damien S.'s new legal representation straight into the federal counterorder right now, before the judge finalized the signature. If that toxic criminal connection was formally placed on the judicial record during the review, it would instantly alter the entire context of the civil filing, transforming a routine domestic asset dispute into a glaring piece of evidence directly linked to an active federal racketeering investigation. Caruso's voice dropped into a tense register of professional admiration, muttering for her to grant him exactly 3 minutes as the distant sound of frantic typing echoed across the line. Victoria threw the sedan into a restricted loading zone exactly 2 blocks from the Marchetti law offices, slamming the door shut as the sub-zero February air struck her face like a physical blow. She did not run. Running was a visible behavioral tell that communicated vulnerability to anyone watching the street. She walked with a rapid, rhythmic cadence, her boot heels striking the concrete with absolute authority. The heavy manila envelope, containing Vanessa's written agreements, clutched tightly inside her winter coat. Her phone was gripped firmly in her right hand, her entire physiological system operating at the hyper-focused pitch of a person who had entirely moved past the capacity for fear. Fear required an uncertain future, but Victoria Sterling had already mapped the exact geometry of her survival grid, and she was ready to execute it to the millimeter. She pushed through the heavy glass doors of the mid-rise building, her presence instantly fracturing the artificial serenity of the corporate lobby. The space was suspended in a heavy, toxic silence. The woman stationed at the grand reception desk had gone completely rigid, her hands hovering frozen over her telephone console, while 2 corporate executives near the elevator banks had entirely stopped moving, their eyes locked onto the high-stakes confrontation unfolding near the security gates. Damien Blackwood stood in the center of the marble floor, flanked by two bulky, silent men whose tailored coats couldn't mask the aggressive physical stillness of Chicago syndicate operatives. The third operative was stationed near the entrance, his body shifting as Victoria marched past him as if he were nothing more than a ghost in the corridor. Standing directly between Damien and the elevator call panel was the young FBI field agent Caruso had deployed. His posture was a masterclass in professional delaying tactics, his frame unyielding as he utilized every ounce of his federal authority to block the mafia boss from ascending to Marcus's office. The moment the glass doors clicked shut, Damien spun on his heel. His face flickered with a sudden, unmanaged burst of surprise before his features rapidly rearranged themselves into a cold, predatory confidence. It was the expression of a master manipulator who had thoroughly rehearsed for a confrontation and was now deciding exactly which version of his power to deploy. He held up the stamped state court document with a theatrical flourish, his deep voice carrying through the hollow lobby as he called out her name, asserting that his actions were completely processed, legal, and absolute. Victoria stopped exactly 2 feet away from him, plunging directly into his defensive perimeter until she could see the tight, rhythmic twitching of the muscle in his jaw. She did not raise her voice. She did not allow a single trace of emotional heat to compromise the structural clarity of her delivery. Her words cut through the grand lobby like a clinical diagnosis, stating flatly that the attorney of record on his emergency filing was a dirty asset tracker directly linked to a federal criminal investigation. She told him with ironclad finality that his criminal connection was being entered into the federal registry by Agent Caruso at that exact second. She explained that the moment the counterorder cleared the system, the state document he was holding in his hand would instantly become a primary piece of evidence in an active federal proceeding, and any physical action taken under its authority would be legally classified as federal obstruction of justice. The 2 Chicago operatives stationed behind Damien instantly exchanged a swift, defensive look, their corporate posture fracturing as they recalculated the immense legal liabilities of remaining inside the building. Damien stared at her, his eyes bloodshot, his breath forming a hot vapor between them. Victoria stepped even closer, her voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that belonged entirely to the bedroom hours of a 12-year war. She laid out his entire strategy out loud, stating precisely that he had rushed to this building because he believed he possessed a narrow, 2-hour operational window before the federal grand jury closed the grid around his assets. He had come to physically seize Marcus's files because those ledgers contained the definitive forensic trail linking the Chicago dirty money straight to his personal banking accounts. She looked at his clenching jaw and delivered the final, crushing blow. You don't have a 2-hour window, Damien. You have exactly 90 seconds before Caruso files that connection, and this entire marble lobby becomes a federal obstruction scene. In the agonizing silence that followed, Victoria watched as something entirely unprecedented occurred within the contours of her husband's face. The constructed, unshakable confidence of a man who had spent decades forcing entire corporate rooms to arrange themselves around his gravity began to structurally shatter from the inside out. It wasn't a dramatic, explosive collapse that the strangers near the elevators or the receptionist could easily identify, but to Victoria, who had spent 12 grueling years studying every micro-expression, every performance, and every late-night shadow of his true self, the fracture was completely visible. Damien Blackwood was terrified. The invincible king of the New York underworld was looking into the eyes of the woman he thought he had broken hours ago, and he was finally realizing that he was completely outmatched. Her phone buzzed violently in her palm. She glanced down at the screen to see a single, definitive word text from Caruso. Filed. She raised her dark eyes back to her husband, her posture as rigid and unyielding as granite as she delivered the final baseline. It's done. Damien looked down at the state court order in his hand, then around the quiet lobby at the men behind him, who were already stepping back toward the exit, their survival instincts overriding their loyalty to his failing empire. He dropped his chin, his voice sinking into a low, private register that used to pass for intimacy before she learned that privacy was just another layer of his performance. He muttered hoarsely that this war was not over, but Victoria merely looked through him, her voice carrying the absolute finality of a closing cell door as she replied, "Yes, it is. You just don't know it yet." One of the Chicago operatives reached out, muttering a low, urgent warning directly into Damien's ear as he pointed toward the street. A tense, silent confirmation passed between them, and Damien turned back to look at Victoria one final time, for a fraction of a second. His face bore an expression she would re-examine during the quiet, lonely hours of the aftermath, the raw, human look of a man who finally understood exactly what he had thrown away in a grand ballroom entry with a staged humiliation and a camel coat. He had never genuinely believed that the woman standing across from him possessed the lethal capacity to fight back, and that overinflated arrogance had cost him everything. He turned and walked toward the glass doors, his exit completely stripped of any strategic dignity or corporate poise. He fled the space the way water violently leaves a collapsing pipe when the structural pressure finds its release. Victoria stood perfectly stationary in the center of the lobby, her dark eyes tracking the black SUV as it pulled away from the curb and vanished entirely into the roaring stream of midday Manhattan traffic. She leaned her shoulders flat against the marble wall, letting the cold stones support her weight for exactly 4 seconds, the first 4 seconds in 31 hours, that she was not actively managing a catastrophe. Then, she breathed deeply through her nose, straightened her blouse, and walked toward the elevators to go upstairs. The morning light of another February day came through the tall windows of the study on West 74th Street, catching the same slate-gray New York sky above the Manhattan roofline. It had been exactly 1 year since Damien Blackwood had walked through the front door of the estate with a pregnant mistress on his arm, fully cloaked in the absolute arrogance that the woman standing before him would break. Victoria Sterling sat alone at her desk, her posture as unyielding as it had been throughout the grinding months of depositions, civil proceedings, and corporate warfare. The legal proceedings had not moved quickly, as nothing in the volatile intersection of federal criminal law and complex asset litigation ever did. The waiting had been its own unique, low-grade punishment, far more wearing than the acute crisis of that initial midnight showdown. Yet, on this Tuesday afternoon, the structural finality of the war had finally settled into place. Special Agent Frank Caruso had called her private line just moments earlier to deliver the definitive baseline of the sentencing phase. 7 years in a federal penitentiary, compounded by crushing civil judgments that would completely liquefy what remained of Damien's illicit assets. Vincent Reel had been indicted separately on the exact same day, his flight pattern to Miami ultimately serving as an explicit confirmation of guilt for the federal prosecution. He was currently detained, while Gregor Szabo's larger syndicate in Chicago faced a sweeping, multi-year federal racketeering investigation that would dismantle their entire operational pipeline. Even Raymond Vance had narrowly managed to keep his legal license after his formal withdrawal, retreating to a quiet, minor practice in New Jersey, where he no longer occupied closed rooms where fates were decided. Victoria had listened to the data with a calm, rhythmic breathing, her mother's mathematical mind, recording the final entries into the ledger of their destruction. She had not attended the formal sentencing. She had already done her part in the windowless conference rooms across from federal attorneys, whose relentless questions never managed to alter her ironclad baseline. The audio recording Damien had spent 6 months preparing to frame her for marital asset fraud had ultimately crumbled under the weight of the Marchetti sisters' legal strategy, when contextualized within the full forensic documentation of the asset transfers, the sworn medical affidavit of Dr. Claire Lawson, and Raymond Vance's documented defection. What Damien had engineered as a weapon of fraud became an undeniable proof of defensive restructuring a woman, documenting her exit from a dangerous empire with absolute, flawless legality. The physical communications archive stolen from her mother Eleanor's storage unit was never recovered, a deep, lingering loss that Victoria had grieved properly through weeks of private anger before filing it away into the compartment of things that were finished. The federal records Caruso's team compiled over 26 months had effectively replaced those missing papers, leaving her defense grid entirely intact and legally clean. Behind her, the sprawling estate had completed its total systemic transformation under the invisible, meticulous labor of Marcus Webb. Marcus had flatly declined 3 lucrative corporate offers during the grinding height of the litigation, answering her quiet inquiries with the brief, unshakable loyalty of a man who finished exactly what he started. The bad part of their history was entirely finished. The rest of it was an accumulation of real purpose. By late autumn, the mansion had been formally registered and funded as the headquarters of the Sterling Leadership Foundation. Its mandate was explicit and deeply humanistic, providing high-security residential housing, mentorship, and full academic scholarships for 8 young women from first-generation, working-class backgrounds who possessed the relentless analytical precision required to climb the cutthroat ladders of law and finance. The East Wing rooms Damien had ordered, prepared for his mistress, had been entirely stripped of their oppressive, superficial opulence, repainted a deep, warm cream, and fitted with heavy wooden bookshelves and expansive desks built for actual, sustained use. Victoria had introduced herself to the first residents by her first name, performing absolutely nothing for their consumption, choosing instead to let the building mean what it meant over an accumulation of daily, quiet work. Vanessa Collins' son, Samuel, had been born healthy and loud in the thick of the April thaw, 6 days after his birth. Victoria's amended trust provisions were officially finalized and stamped, locking a clean, separate fortune into the grid that would become available for his education at 18, and without restriction at 25. The funds were entirely insulated from the federal asset forfeitures and civil judgments, ensuring that the child had a future that was never contingent on the wreckage of the adult world he had been born into. Vanessa had cooperated fully with the Marchetti firm, her November agreements providing the definitive civil proof that Damien had been covertly tyrannizing marital assets long before the staged confrontation at the door. She was now raising her son alone in a city that was largely indifferent to the grace required to execute such competence. But she had secured a corporate position entirely on her own merits, a job that paid far less than the orchestrated trajectory Damien had manufactured for her, but one that felt, for the very first time, like it belonged entirely to her. Victoria and Vanessa had not become friends, but they shared a functional, honest relationship that was only possible between two survivors who had stood on opposite sides of the same disaster and understood it was not of their own making. During a brief coffee meeting in October, Vanessa had asked if she hated him, and Victoria had answered with a cold, clear seriousness. Hate required a continued investment of attention. She had simply grown too tired to banish her attention on a phantom. Victoria looked at her personal laptop screen, her fingers poised over the keyboard as the building began to breathe and come alive with the morning's operational energy. She could hear the distinct percussion of footsteps on the grand stairs and the animated, rapid-fire cadence of Deja, a brilliant 23-year-old law student from Akron who possessed the exact same unnerving capacity for sustained attention that Victoria carried in her own youth. There was no version of this outcome that had been easy, clean, or without an intense, lasting cost to every human element involved on the board. The world did not settle its accounts with the pristine precision of a financial ledger. The justice that had arrived was real, but it was partial, requiring constant vigilance, maintenance, and effort. Somewhere in the isolated silence of a federal penitentiary, a man who had once mistook patience for weakness was beginning the long, impossible work of understanding the architecture of his own ruin. He would likely never fully comprehend it, choosing instead to construct alternative narratives that centered his own suffering and left his ego blameless. Because a federal conviction could never alter a person's fundamental relationship to the truth, Victoria was entirely done being angry about that reality. She was 42 years old. She looked it. She had an immense amount of real work to do. Outside the window, the winter garden stood stationary in the frozen ground, waiting for what came next. Victoria Sterling looked down at her screen and began to type. As a writer who has spent over 30 years navigating the dark psychology of underworld thrones, I have learned that true empires are never secured by brute force or loud intimidation. They are won or lost through the silent architecture of the mind. The calculated fall of Damien Blackwood is not merely a tale of a broken marriage or a fallen tycoon. It is a brilliant, real-world dissection of how unchecked arrogance inevitably engineers its own destruction. Damien built his entire life on his unique ability to read and exploit human weakness, believing that bringing his pregnant mistress, Vanessa, through the front door of their $12 million Manhattan estate would shatter his wife's pride and force a reckless, vulnerable reaction. He engineered a defense against her potential rage, but he was completely blind to her quiet, systemized intelligence. For 12 years, Victoria Sterling had stood beside him, choosing to patiently document his illicit financial grids and build a hidden, defensive fortress of trusts rather than execute a premature, emotional exit. Her silent calm when she left her 3-carat diamond ring on the marble entry table delivers the story's first profound moral lesson. Never mistake a person's patience for weakness. Real power does not scream. It calculates, operates with complete legality, and waits for the perfect geometric alignment to strike. Yet, the absolute soul and highest humanistic value of this narrative do not reside in Victoria's brilliant financial traps, but in her capacity for profound compassion over cheap vengeance. When she faced Vanessa Collins in the East Wing, she chose to strip away the bitter narrative of a betrayed wife. She recognized that Damien and the Chicago syndicate were weaponizing the unborn child purely as a legal mechanism to force asset challenges and crack open her family trusts. Instead of punishing the mistress, Victoria extended an unyielding shield of human kindness, amending her independent estate provisions to guarantee the innocent child a secure, protected future that Damien could never touch. In doing so, she broke the cycle of malice. She taught us that true strength is defined by our willingness to protect those who have no voice in the wars of powerful men. By choosing solidarity and dignity over an act of revenge, she successfully transformed a bitter enemy into her most critical witness for justice. Ultimately, this story leaves the audience with an unforgettable lesson about legacy and real self-worth. Damian Blackwood lost his empire overnight because his power was a borrowed illusion, entirely hollowed out by a deep narcissism that left him incapable of honest self-reflection. Victoria didn't just defeat a mafia boss. She reclaimed her actual life and transformed a multi-million-dollar monument of criminal greed into a sanctuary that empowers the next generation. She teaches us that the ultimate legacy after any great crisis is not what you destroy, but what you build out of the ashes. For anyone listening, let this narrative be a permanent reminder. A structure built on a lie will always collapse when confronted by a mind anchored in the absolute truth.